Usually, when you look at popular science books, there's a tone of triumph. Look at what we have created. Look how smart we are. We're really good at this being human, inventing things thing. And I was finding this tone, I guess, that you don't see often, which is we're not as smart as we think we are. And I kind of want to walk you through a couple of the examples I found in which that was the case, in which we had everything we needed to invent a piece of technology and then didn't do it for a really astoundingly long period of time. And usually it was because we were laboring under a bad hypothesis. We thought something was true that wasn't. So the first example is this beautiful stock footage I purchased of a compass. So here's the compass. They could have been invented in 200 BCE. This is when the ancient Greeks started noticing they had these lodestones that were naturally magnetic. They were actually invented in 1000 CE, which is 1,200 years of time between the two. And you'll think, oh, okay, well, you know, compasses are pretty complicated. That's a tiny sliver of metal balanced on a pin sandwiched between two layers of plastic. I can see why that would take some time. But when the compass was invented in China around 1000 CE, first it was used for fortune telling for 100 or so years before it was used for navigation. And these first compasses were not the plastic thing I was describing. If you have a lodestone, a piece of magnetic material, it's naturally going to want to turn to point towards magnetic north. To allow it to freely turn, you just have to tie your rock to a string. The string supports the rock rotates freely. Tying a rock to a string took us over 1,000 years to figure out, because we were operating under this bad hypothesis that some rocks are just weird. I'll give you another example. Beautiful stock footage of a cute dog and a stethoscope. So stethoscopes could have been invented in 300 BCE. This is when we first came up with paper. They were actually invented in 1816 CE. The story here is you have this Victorian doctor, man, heterosexual, and he has a theory that the sounds that bodies make could be diagnostic as a medical professional. And so he's been pressing his ear to his patient's chest. And then one day he has a patient, female, busty, and he's like, this is too erotic for me. I simply cannot press my ear to that chest. I need to leave room for Jesus. And so he rolls up some paper, makes a tube, uses that, and discovers by accident that the tube isolates and enhances the sounds he's trying to hear that were in fact diagnostic. And so it took us 2,000 years between when we could have invented the stethoscope and did, and this was the only example in my research that I found of actual scientific progress being made by someone who was too horny to do their job properly. So it did pay off in this instance. Bad hypothesis paper is boring, and I hate it. Another piece of technology. You all recognize these. These are buttons. Not really a difficult thing to figure out. So they could have been invented in 2800 BCE. This is when we first found evidence of humans tying pretty rocks and shells to their clothing to make themselves look nicer. Actually invented in around 1200 CE, which is 4,000 years of space. And what's killer is that the button is a great piece of technology. It allows clothes to be form-fitting. You don't have to fit them over your head. It allows them to be sturdier. And we spent 4,000 years thinking we looked pretty good with these nice shells attached to our shirts, when really we looked like idiots who didn't know how a button worked. Didn't know how to put a slit in the other side to seal clothing. So, you know, not our greatest hour or 4,000 years. And the bad hypothesis we had here was that fashion is never practical. Give you another example. This image of milk represents the process of pasteurization. So pasteurization is a process in which you take a food, you bring it up to almost the boiling point, then you let it cool. This kills the bacteria in the food, making it much more safer to drink. Milk without pasteurization is really dangerous food to drink when it's been left out for a while. With pasteurization, it becomes one of the safest. Could have invented around 10,500 BCE. This is when we first started doing farming. We first started having animals. We might want to drink their milk regularly. Actually invented in 1117 CE, and then reinvented in the 1800s by Louis Pasteur, who puts his name all over it. 11,500 years where we could have had this technology and didn't, which is, I will say it, I mean, I'm a human, some of my best friends are humans, but this is pretty embarrassing for all of us. Bad hypothesis, food goes bad sometimes, oh well, nothing we can do. One last example of this, hot air balloons, symbolizing the human dream of flight, the most canonical example of humans striving to be more than what they are. We want to fly, we finally achieve it with lighter than air flight with hot air balloons. Could have been invented in 200 BCE. This is where in China they come up with paper lanterns, which can fly. They have everything they need right there. Actually invented in 1783 CE by the Montgolfier brothers in France. And the Montgolfier brothers are great because they have no idea what they're doing. They have a fire and they discover that this sack on top elevates and they say, oh my God, we just discovered Montgolfier gas, which allows things to fly. So we'll build a big Montgolfier balloon and fill it with Montgolfier gas and people will be able to fly, and it works. What they don't realize is that their whole theory behind it is wrong. It's just that less dense air floats to the top and that's what makes things fly. That's 2,000 years. We could have had it and didn't, but it actually gets worse because the Montgolfier's first balloon wasn't the silks you saw on the previous slide. It was a burlap sack lined with paper. And you can make a burlap sack lined with paper out of natural plant and animal fibers. If you knew what you were doing, one person working alone over the course of their life could easily collect enough fiber to make a big burlap sack, line it with a lot of paper, and achieve the eternal dream of human flight at any point in human history. So these were fun things to discover about our shared past, but if you are going back in time, there are a lot of things that you can reinvent and take the credit for, and it's not just technology. There's things in art and music that also can be plagiarized, if you want to call it that, from the present, and brought back to the past. Obviously with art, art styles are something that we invented, and you can take the credit for different styles, put them in different areas, but even art has technological aspects attached to it. A great example here is perspective. This is single point perspective. Everything goes towards a single vanishing point. We all learned this in art class in maybe grade 1 or 2. It's a way to draw cool things in 3D. But the fact that single point perspective, everything goes towards a single vanishing point, we had to figure that out. And before we figured that out, even with multiple point perspective, we had some troubles. Here's a painting from the 600s CE where the artist is clearly wanting to draw in perspective, but he's struggling a bit. You can see here the table is sort of wonky. This vanishing point's over here. This one's over here. I'm not sure what's going on with this cabinet. But he doesn't have a coherent theory of how things recede, just knows that they do in some way. Without the technology of perspective, he can't draw things properly in a realistic way. And you could argue that, okay, well, this was the style at the time. Everyone liked things to look this wonky, and they could have drawn in perspective, they just didn't want to. But that argument is kind of undermined by noticing that when we do figure out the rules of perspective, artists go hog wild for it. It happened in the Renaissance in Europe. Da Vinci, 1495 CE. This is sort of a hard piece of art to look at with fresh eyes because we've all seen it so often. But if you do look at it with fresh eyes, you can see that it's about 5% religion and 95% of like, bro, check it out, I can draw in perspective. I got cubes or squares on the wall, I got squares on the ceiling, they're sitting at a nice rectangle in a flat plane. It is Da Vinci showing off that he can draw a 3D picture and make it look great. And it's not just Da Vinci, Raphael, philosophers, famous work in the Western canon around the same time, and Raphael can draw a friggin' cube. There's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. These are just elongated cubes, these steps. He's very excited to show off what he can do now with this new technology. And it reminds me nothing more than of images in like the late 80s, early 90s where he figured out ray tracing and everyone was doing chrome spheres over checkerboard patterns. Or like when we get lens flares to work, you get a lot of that showing up all of a sudden. People like to play with new toys.